I am Maya. I am 35 years old, and right now I am looking at a faded, crumbling piece of yellow paper. It is the only inheritance my family ever gave me. When I was 16, I woke up in the middle of a freezing winter night to absolute silence. The power had been shut off. My parents and my younger sister Chloe had packed their bags and abandoned me. They drained my entire college savings account to pay off a mountain of debt they had accumulated to fund Chloe's lavish lifestyle. They left me in a foreclosed house with nothing but an empty pantry and that yellow sticky note stuck to the kitchen counter. It read, "You will figure it out." For 19 agonizingly difficult years, I did exactly that. I survived. I clawed my way up from the bottom, and I built a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire right here in Atlanta. For almost 2 decades, they acted like I was dead. But yesterday, they suddenly reappeared. They did not come back to ask for my forgiveness. They crashed one of the most exclusive billionaire charity galas in the city to publicly humiliate and extort me. What they do not realize is that they just walked straight into a trap I have been setting for years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build a fortress to protect yourself from the very people who share your blood. Trust me, you are going to want to hear exactly how this plays out. It all started last night at the Atlanta Heritage Foundation charity auction. This is an extremely private invite-only event reserved for the absolute upper echelon of the city. We are talking about major real estate developers, tech billionaires, and hedge fund managers. As the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Commercial Trust, I sponsor a premium table every single year. I was sitting there in a custom emerald green gown, sipping sparkling water and discussing a massive new commercial zoning project with the city commissioner. I belonged in that room. I had paid my dues in blood and sweat to secure my seat among the elite. The atmosphere was immaculate, filled with the soft sound of a live string quartet and the quiet hum of immense wealth. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open, and the absolute last people I ever expected to see walked through. It was my younger sister Chloe and her husband Chad. They were not on the guest list. I knew for an absolute fact they did not have the net worth to even walk past the security guards at the valet stand. Chloe was wearing a heavily sequined designer dress that screamed desperate for attention, likely purchased on a credit card she could not afford to pay off. Next to her was Chad wearing a velvet tuxedo jacket that looked completely ridiculous. Chad is a white man who loves to cosplay as a Silicon Valley tech genius, even though his actual business is a failing cryptocurrency startup built on lies and borrowed money. He has always harbored this deep, toxic resentment toward me. He constantly projects these subtle microaggressions, making passive-aggressive comments, implying that my massive success as a Black woman is simply the result of diversity initiatives and not my own cutthroat business acumen. He believes he is the natural-born elite of the family, and my presence at the top of the financial food chain deeply offends his fragile ego. Without missing a beat, they spotted me and marched straight across the ballroom floor toward my table. They did not say hello. They did not ask how I have been for the last 19 years. Chad simply grabbed 2 empty chairs from a neighboring table, dragged them over, and forced his way into my circle. He poured himself a glass of my vintage champagne and immediately started talking over the city commissioner, loudly pitching his worthless tech startup to the billionaires sitting next to me. He used empty corporate buzzwords, trying desperately to sound important. I maintained my composure. I kept my back perfectly straight and my expression completely neutral, refusing to give them the reaction they were starving for. Then, the live auction portion of the evening began. A stunning original abstract painting was brought onto the main stage. The auctioneer announced the starting bid at $50,000. Before I could even consider raising my numbered paddle to make a modest charitable donation, Chad leaned across the table and violently snatched the paddle right out of my hand. He thrust it into the air with a smug, arrogant grin. Someone across the room immediately countered with $60,000. Chad did not even flinch. He raised my paddle again, shouting out 75,000. I leaned toward him and quietly told him to put the paddle down immediately. I reminded him that he was playing a dangerous game with money he did not have. Chad just laughed, that condescending, patronizing laugh that made my blood boil. He told me to quiet down and let the men handle the business. He loudly proclaimed that he was networking and proving to these heavy hitters that he was a major player. Chloe sat next to him, beaming with pride, completely delusional to the reality of the situation. The bidding war spiraled out of control in mere seconds. 100,000, 120,000. Chad was sweating, but his ego was driving the car. Finally, he screamed out $150,000. The room went silent. The auctioneer pointed his gavel directly at Chad and yelled "Sold" to the gentleman at the Apex Trust table. The entire ballroom erupted into applause. Chad stood up and took a theatrical bow while Chloe blew kisses to the crowd. Less than a minute later, the senior event coordinator approached our table carrying a silver tray with a payment terminal. She offered Chad a warm, professional smile and asked him how he would prefer to settle the $150,000 donation. Chad did not reach for his wallet. He did not look nervous. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, swirling his stolen champagne, and placed his hand heavily onto my shoulder. He looked around the table, making direct eye contact with the billionaires and city officials sitting with us. Then, with a sickening smirk on his face, he pointed his finger right at me. "My sister-in-law Maya will cover it," he announced loudly, his voice echoing over the quiet jazz music. "It is just pocket change for her. Besides, she owes our family a massive favor for everything we have done for her." The entire table froze. The conversations around us stopped entirely. The event coordinator stared at me in shock. Chad and Chloe just sat there smiling with supreme confidence, absolutely certain that my fear of making a public scene and embarrassing myself in front of my elite peers would force me to quietly swipe my corporate card and swallow their ultimate disrespect. I did not reach for my clutch. I did not break eye contact with the event coordinator. I let the agonizing silence stretch for 10 full seconds, allowing the weight of the moment to settle completely over the table. The billionaires sitting next to me were watching with sharp, calculating eyes. In the world of high finance, how you handle a crisis in public tells everyone exactly how you handle your business in private. Chad gave me a slight nod, a silent, arrogant command to just pay the money and save face. He was betting everything on the assumption that my professional reputation meant more to me than $150,000. He was about to learn a very expensive lesson about who I really am. I placed my linen napkin neatly on the table, folded my hands together, and offered the event coordinator a polite, apologetic smile. I spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm, perfectly modulated, and loud enough for everyone at our table to hear clearly. "I am terribly sorry for this disruption," I said, looking directly at the coordinator. "I do not know these two individuals. They are not on my guest list, they are not affiliated with Apex Commercial Trust, and they certainly do not have authorization to charge anything to my corporate accounts." The color instantly drained from Chad's face. His smug, confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Chloe gasped, her eyes darting nervously around the table as the wealthy guests began whispering to each other. Chad leaned forward, dropping his voice to an angry hiss. "Maya, stop playing games," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Just swipe the damn card. My venture capital funds are temporarily tied up. Do not embarrass us in front of these people." I ignored him completely. I raised my right hand and caught the eye of Marcus, the head of event security, who was already monitoring the sudden tension at our table. Marcus, a massive man in a tailored dark suit, was at my side within seconds, accompanied by 3 other security personnel. "Is there a problem here?" Ms. Maya Marcus asked respectfully. "Yes, Marcus," I replied smoothly. "These 2 individuals have somehow bypassed the front desk. They are uninvited trespassers attempting to commit financial fraud using my corporate identity. Please escort them off the premises immediately." Chloe grabbed my arm. her manicured nails digging into my skin. She was hyperventilating, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and profound embarrassment. "You cannot do this to us," she whispered frantically. "Mom is going to be absolutely furious with you. You are making us look like fools." I looked down at her hand, then back up to her face, my expression completely frozen. I slowly peeled her fingers off my arm one by one. "You made yourselves look like fools." "Chloe," I replied softly. "I am simply providing the audience." Marcus stepped in his massive frame, easily wedging between me and my sister. He firmly grasped Chad by the upper arm. "Sir, you need to come with us right now," Marcus commanded. Chad tried to pull away, his fragile ego shattering into a million pieces. He started shouting, making a complete spectacle of himself. He yelled about his non-existent tech company demanding respect, claiming he was a personal friend of the foundation director. The more he shouted, the more pathetic he looked. The security team expertly boxed them in, forcing them away from the table and steering them toward the grand exit at the back of the ballroom. As they were being guided away, I stood up from my chair and stepped directly into their path, bringing the entire procession to a brief halt. Chad was breathing heavily, his velvet tuxedo jacket rumpled his face, a mask of furious humiliation. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a small protective plastic sleeve. Inside was the faded yellow sticky note from 19 years ago, the exact note they had left on the kitchen counter when they abandoned me in a freezing dark house. I reached forward and smoothly slid the note into the breast pocket of Chad's jacket. He looked down at my hand, confused and deeply humiliated. I leaned in close, so only the two of them could hear me over the classical music playing in the background. "You will figure it out," I whispered. I stepped aside and watched as security physically marched them out the heavy oak doors, casting them back into the humid Atlanta night. I took a deep breath, smoothed my gown, and turned back to the event coordinator. I handed her my sleek black corporate card. "I will personally cover the donation for the painting," I told her warmly. "Consider it a gift to the foundation." I then turned to the billionaires at my table, offered a charming smile, and smoothly transitioned the conversation back to the upcoming commercial zoning laws. I had just demonstrated absolute ruthless control, and I could see the profound respect in their eyes. Hours later, I returned to my sanctuary. I am sitting here now in my penthouse, gazing out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. The camera is slowly circling me as I hold a glass of aged bourbon, the amber liquid catching the soft warm light of the room. This city is my chessboard, and I own the board. Over the past 2 decades, I have built an intricate network of commercial properties, trust funds, and holding companies. I control the spaces where these supposed elites work, shop, and operate. My family thought they could march into my world and assert dominance because we share the same blood. They still see me as the helpless 16-year-old girl they discarded. My phone is currently sitting on the marble kitchen island, vibrating violently every few seconds. The screen is lighting up with a relentless barrage of notifications. Dozens of furious text messages from my mother Vivian demanding to know how I could be so cruel to her perfect daughter and her brilliant son-in-law. Voicemails from my father Richard, calling me a disgrace to the family name and quoting scripture about honoring my parents. They are demanding an immediate meeting tomorrow morning at my corporate office. They think they are going to storm my headquarters, lecture me on family loyalty, and bully me into cutting a check to repair Chad's shattered ego. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, letting the smooth burn ground me. I am not angry. I am simply preparing for war. They drew the first blood tonight, but they have absolutely no idea what they have awakened. I have spent 19 years meticulously accumulating power, wealth, and the kind of undeniable leverage that destroys legacies. Tomorrow morning, when they walk through the glass doors of Apex Commercial Trust, they will not be facing their submissive daughter. They will be walking directly into a financial slaughterhouse. Let them come. The sun had barely risen over the Atlanta skyline the next morning when I arrived at the executive suite of Apex Commercial Trust. My office occupies the entire top floor of the building I own. It is a space designed to project absolute authority. The floors are polished black marble, the walls are lined with modern art, and my desk is a massive slab of imported quartz. It is usually a sanctuary of quiet focus, a place where multi-million-dollar decisions are made before most people even finish their first cup of coffee. But at exactly 9 in the morning, the heavy glass doors to my suite were violently pushed open. My executive assistant, a highly trained professional who usually handles corporate titans with ease, was practically walking backward into my office holding her hands up defensively. "I am so sorry, Ms. Maya," she said, her voice tight with stress. "I told them you were in a closed session, but they refused to wait in the lobby and threatened to call the police if I touched them." I did not flinch. I did not even lift my head from the stack of commercial zoning contracts sitting in front of me. I simply raised my left hand, gesturing for my assistant to step aside. "It is fine, Sarah," I said calmly, keeping my eyes locked on the paperwork. "You can close the door behind them. Hold all my calls for the next 10 minutes. Standing in the center of my pristine office were my parents, Vivian and Richard. They looked entirely out of place in this environment of high finance. My mother, Vivian, was dressed in her finest Sunday church attire, complete with a wide-brimmed hat and a string of fake pearls. She has always used her overbearing religious persona as a shield to justify her toxic behavior. She believes that as long as she sits in the front pew every Sunday, she has the divine right to treat people like garbage Monday through Saturday. My father, Richard, stood slightly behind her wearing a rumpled suit and staring at the floor. He has spent his entire life being her silent enabler, a cowardly man who would rather watch his own daughter freeze in the dark than stand up to his wife. Vivian did not waste a single second. She marched right up to my desk, slammed her designer knockoff handbag down onto the quartz surface, and launched into a furious tirade. "How dare you!" she hissed, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "How dare you treat your own flesh and blood with such vicious disrespect in front of those people last night? I raised you to be a good God-fearing woman, and you behaved like a complete street thug. You embarrassed this entire family." I dipped my solid gold fountain pen into the inkwell, turned to the next page of the contract, and signed my name with a smooth, deliberate flourish. The scratch of the nib against the heavy paper was the only sound in the room for several agonizing seconds. Vivian slammed her hand flat against the desk, desperate to force me to look at her. "Are you listening to me?" she demanded. Chloe was up all night crying hysterically. Chad was so humiliated he could barely speak. "Do you have any idea who you insulted yesterday?" Chad comes from a highly prestigious white family. His father is a retired corporate executive. They have a legacy in the business world. You made him look like a common criminal in front of the most important investors in the city. You validated every single stereotype they have about us, Maya. You acted like you had no home training, showing off your little bit of money just to tear down a brilliant man who is trying to build a technology empire. She paused to catch her breath, pacing back and forth across my office like a caged animal. Richard finally mumbled something under his breath, nodding along with her words. "You need to fix this," Vivian commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my face. "You are going to call the director of that charity foundation today and issue a formal public apology to Chad. You are going to explain that there was a terrible misunderstanding with your banking department. And then to make things right and heal this family, you are going to write a check to fully fund Chad's startup company." I reached the final page of the contract. I carefully aligned the edges of the thick paper, placed it into the outgoing tray, and finally looked up. I did not look at them with anger. I looked at them with the detached clinical curiosity of a scientist observing a particularly annoying insect. "Prestigious white family background," I repeated softly, letting the words roll around the quiet room. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and folded my hands perfectly in my lap. Are we talking about the same Chad? Because the Chad I know is currently driving a Porsche Macan that he financed at a predatory 22% interest rate. And the truly fascinating part about that vehicle, Mother, is that it is not even registered in his prestigious name. Vivian froze. The self-righteous fury on her face instantly shifted into a look of deep, terrified confusion. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I picked up a sleek black tablet from the corner of my desk and swiped the screen with one finger. You see? I continued, my voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. When you run a commercial empire, you have access to top-tier financial intelligence. I ran a full background check on your brilliant son-in-law 6 months ago when he first started bragging about his tech company. His prestigious family went bankrupt in 2008. He has zero venture capital funding. He has zero proprietary technology. What he does have, however, is a mountain of consumer debt. I stood up slowly, planting both hands firmly on the desk and leaning toward them. And the most interesting detail of all, I whispered, locking eyes with my mother. Is that the credit card Chad used to put the down payment on that Portia is registered directly to you, Vivian? You maxed out a card in your own name to help a 34-year-old white man buy a luxury car so he could pretend to be wealthy while you and Richard are currently 3 months behind on your mortgage payments. Richard's head snapped up. He stared at Vivian, his eyes wide with shock. What mortgage payments? He stammered, stepping away from her. Vivian, what is she talking about? You told me the house was fully paid off. Vivian's fake pearls suddenly looked like a noose around her neck. She was breathing heavily, her eyes darting frantically toward the door. She tried to muster her loud, commanding church voice, but all that came out was a high-pitched, defensive stammer. You do not know what you are talking about, she sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at me. You are a liar. You are trying to destroy my marriage because you are bitter and alone. I smiled, a slow, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. I am not lying, Mother, I said smoothly, and I do not need to destroy your marriage. You have already done that yourself. Now I have a 9:30 board meeting to discuss a $30 million acquisition. You have exactly 30 seconds to remove yourselves from my property before I have security drag you out the front doors, just like I did to your precious son-in-law last night. They did not say another word. Richard turned and walked out of the office, his shoulders slumped in defeat, not even looking back to see if his wife was following. Vivian stood there for just a moment longer, her face twisted in pure hatred, realizing that her ultimate secret had just been casually ripped open and thrown in her face. She grabbed her fake designer bag and scurried out the door. The heavy glass shut quietly behind them, restoring the absolute silence of my empire. But I knew the war was far from over. The heavy glass door had barely clicked shut behind my mother when it slowly opened again. Only 10 seconds had passed. My father, Richard, stepped back inside my office alone. He quietly closed the door, leaving Vivian fuming out in the reception area. He turned to me and offered a weak, apologetic smile, slipping effortlessly into his favorite role, the peacemaker, the reasonable man who always tried to smooth things over after his wife dropped a bomb. He walked slowly over to the leather guest chair across from my desk and sat down without asking for permission. He let out a long, heavy sigh, rubbing his hands together as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Maya, you have to understand how your mother gets, he began, his voice soft and placating. She is a passionate woman. She just wants this family to be united. She does not know how to express it properly, but she is hurting. We are all hurting. I set my fountain pen down on the quartz desk. Passionate is a fascinating word for financially reckless and verbally abusive, I replied, my voice completely flat. Richard held up both hands in a gesture of surrender. Okay, I know there is bad blood between us, he said, leaning forward. But just look around you. Look at this incredible office. Look at the empire you have built. You won, Maya. You proved everyone wrong, and you became a massive success. But what good is all this wealth, all this power, if you do not have your family to share it with at the end of the day? I simply stared at him, letting his hollow words hang in the cold air, conditioned air of the room. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat before pressing on. Chad is a smart guy. Richard continued, trying to sound authoritative. He just hit a rough patch with the economy. His technology startup is on the verge of a major breakthrough. He just needs a little push to get his prototype off the ground and secure his patents. $5 million, Maya. That is all he needs. $5 million is an absolute drop in the bucket for Apex Commercial Trust. You probably make that much in a month. If you just swallow your pride and make this investment, it would fix everything. It would give Chad his dignity back. It would save his marriage to your sister. And your mother would finally give you the respect and love you have always wanted from her. Just be the bigger person and write the check. I sat perfectly still. The sheer audacity of his request echoed in my ears. He was sitting in my building surrounded by the empire I bled to build, asking me to hand $5 million to a racist, arrogant white man who publicly insulted me less than 12 hours ago, all to buy the conditional love of a mother who threw me away. Swallow my pride, I repeated softly. You want me to give $5 million to fix the family bond. Let us talk about family bonds, Richard. Let us talk about what this family does when someone is in trouble. Do you remember November 12th, exactly 19 years ago? Richard visibly swallowed hard. He looked away, staring at a modern art painting on my wall. I was 16 years old. I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. Chloe was 13. She sneaked out of the house in the middle of the night, stole the keys to Vivian's car, and went to a high school party she had no business attending. On her way home, she ran a red light and completely totaled a parked luxury sedan. A hit and run. She panicked, drove the smashed car back home, and went to sleep as if nothing happened. But she was caught on a neighbor's security camera. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. The police knocked on our door the next morning, I said, never breaking eye contact with him. The owner of the car was threatening a massive civil lawsuit. You and Vivian were absolutely terrified. Not terrified that your 13-year-old daughter could have been killed, but terrified that your golden child was going to end up in juvenile detention and ruin your pristine, hypocritical church reputation. So what did the great peacemaker do? I leaned across the desk, closing the distance between us. You marched down to the bank. You forged my signature on the custodial documents. You completely drained the college savings account that Grandpa Theodore had spent 10 years building for me. $42,000, gone in a single afternoon. You stole every last cent of my future to pay off the victim, hire a defense attorney for Chloe, and keep the police quiet. Maya, we had no choice. Richard stammered, his face flushing with shame. The lawyer fees were astronomical. Chloe was just a fragile little girl. We knew you were smart. We knew you would always land on your feet. You did not need the money as badly as she needed our protection. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that held zero amusement. I was a child. I was a straight-A student who dreamed of going to a top university. You stole my future to protect a criminal. And when that $42,000 was still not enough to cover your mounting secret debts, you packed your bags in the middle of the night. You abandoned the house to the bank. You left me asleep in my bed without a second thought. You saved Chloe, and you threw me to the wolves with a sticky note telling me to figure it out. I stood up from my chair, towering over him. And now, 19 years later, you have the absolute nerve to sit in my office and ask me for $5 million to save her husband's fragile ego. Richard stood up quickly, his mask of the gentle father completely dissolving. His face hardened into a mask of bitter resentment. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You are so arrogant, he spat. You think your money makes you a god. You think you are completely untouchable just because you have your name on a building. You are selfish, Maya. God blesses those who help their families, and you are going to lose everything with that rotten attitude. I am selfish because you taught me that I only have myself, I replied coldly. I am not your bank, Richard. I am not your sacrificial lamb anymore. I am the butcher. Get out of my office. He stared at me for a long moment, his chest heaving with anger. You are going to regret this, he muttered darkly. Family always finds a way to balance the scales. He turned around and stormed out of my office, letting the heavy glass door slam shut behind him. I sat back down in my chair, taking a deep, steadying breath. He thought his little threat was intimidating. He had absolutely no idea that the real threat was already waiting for me on my phone. The phone on my desk vibrated exactly 3 times before I picked it up. I did not even have to look at the caller ID to know who was on the other end of the line. I swiped the screen, brought the phone to my ear, and remained perfectly silent. For a long moment, the only sound was the heavy, uneven breathing of a man who was practically vibrating with adrenaline, followed by a low, arrogant chuckle. "Well," Maya Chad said, his voice dripping with a sickening blend of false sympathy and absolute condescension. "It seems your little security stunt at the gala last night is going to cost you a lot more than $150,000. You really should have just swiped the card when I told you to. Now things are going to get incredibly complicated for you." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the ceiling. "Is that so, Chad?" I asked, my tone completely flat. He launched into a meticulously rehearsed monologue, speaking with the unearned confidence of a mediocre man who had never faced a real consequence in his entire life. He told me that while I was busy showing off for the city elite, he had been doing some deep investigative networking. He claimed to have connected with a disgruntled former environmental inspector who had access to the preliminary land survey reports for the Apex commercial complex. That complex was my flagship development, a $300 million project set to redefine the downtown district. Chad proudly announced that he was currently looking at a flash drive full of highly confidential documents. These documents allegedly proved that my firm had bribed city officials to ignore severe toxic soil contamination on the build site, effectively bypassing critical environmental safety regulations to save millions in cleanup costs. The implication was devastatingly clear. He knew the documents were fabricated dirt. I knew they were fabricated dirt. But in the hyper-competitive world of high-stakes commercial real estate, the truth is entirely irrelevant when a scandal breaks. A leaked corruption story regarding environmental hazards, even a completely baseless one, would trigger an immediate injunction from the city council. It would stall my construction teams for months, terrify my primary investors into pulling their capital, and bleed my corporate accounts dry in defensive legal fees. Chad spelled this all out for me very slowly, over enunciating his words, using the patronizing tone of a disappointed teacher scolding a slow student. "I have close personal friends at 3 major financial publications right now." Chad lied smoothly, his ego expanding with every word he spoke. "All it takes is one quick email from me with these documents attached, and your entire empire is tied up in a massive federal investigation by Monday morning. You will lose your investors, you will lose your licenses, and you will lose that fancy glass office you love so much. But because I am a generous man, and because Vivian has literally begged me to show you some family mercy, I am willing to offer you a very simple way out of this mess." I let the silence stretch over the line. I let him bask in the warm glow of his imaginary victory. I needed him to feel completely in control. "What is your price, Chad?" I finally asked, intentionally making my voice sound a fraction softer, adding just a hint of desperation to my tone. He practically purred into the receiver. $5 million, Maya. Seed capital for my technology firm. A clean, fully documented corporate investment from Apex Trust. And I do not want you just wiring the money. I want you to deliver the check to me personally. We are having a traditional Sunday dinner at your parents' house tomorrow evening. You are going to walk through that front door. You are going to apologize to my wife for your disgusting behavior last night, and you are going to hand me that check in front of everyone. You are going to tell Vivian and Richard that you were wrong, and that you believe in my vision." He paused, taking a sharp breath to deliver his final threat. "If you fail to show up, or if you try to pull any of your little corporate power plays, I press send on this email, and I watch your stock plummet into the ground. Do we have an understanding?" I took a slow, deep breath, calculating exactly how much rope to give the beast so it could properly hang itself. "I will be there tomorrow at 6 o'clock, I said quietly. "Have the investment contracts printed and ready to sign." "Excellent choice, Maya." "See you at dinner," he replied smugly, hanging up the phone before I could say another word. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear and set it face down on the cool quartz surface of my desk. The absolute silence of the executive suite returned, but the invisible energy in the room had completely shifted. Chad genuinely believed he had just cornered a titan of industry. He believed he had successfully intimidated and outsmarted a woman who navigated shark-infested waters for a living. What the brilliant technology founder did not realize was that there was no disgruntled environmental inspector. The fake zoning documents he was so proudly holding were drafted on a secure encrypted server in my own legal department 3 weeks ago. I had intentionally leaked that specific flash drive to one of his desperate, heavily indebted poker buddies, knowing exactly how Chad's greedy mind worked. I knew he would try to use it against me the second he felt his ego was threatened. I had meticulously designed and built the very cage he was currently locking himself inside. I pushed my heavy chair back and stood up from the desk. I walked slowly over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the bustling streets of Atlanta far below me. The camera smoothly shifts its perspective, tilting slightly to the side in a sharp Dutch angle, capturing my reflection in the glass before panning around to face me directly. The subtle, unnatural tilt of the lens distorts the pristine geometry of the office, perfectly reflecting the sudden, dangerous shift in reality. I looked directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall, and I let a cold, highly calculated smirk spread across my face. They think they are extorting a helpless 16-year-old girl, I say softly, the words cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. They do not realize they just woke up a monster. Sunday evening arrived with a suffocating humid heat that only Atlanta can produce. I pulled my understated custom black sedan into the winding driveway of my parents' suburban home exactly at 6 o'clock. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, leaving the engine running, just staring at the sprawling 2-story brick house. This was the same house they had abandoned me in 19 years ago, the one that had been foreclosed on by the bank. After I quietly bought the bad debt through a shell company years later, I allowed them to move back in as renters, purely to keep them exactly where I could see them. They had absolutely no idea that their wealthy, mysterious corporate landlord was the daughter they threw away. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. If my life were a movie, this is the exact moment the camera would switch to a smooth, unbroken Steadicam shot. The lens would track me from behind, gliding perfectly in sync with my deliberate, measured footsteps as I walked up the concrete path. The visual would capture the pristine, manicured lawns and the perfectly painted shutters contrasting sharply with the dark, heavy energy radiating from the front door. I pressed the doorbell, hearing the familiar, obnoxiously loud chime echo through the halls. Vivian threw the door open with a wide, theatrical smile plastered across her face. She was performing for the neighbors, making sure anyone looking out their windows saw the picture-perfect image of a loving mother welcoming her successful daughter home for a traditional Sunday dinner. She pulled me into a suffocating hug that felt completely hollow, her heavy floral perfume clashing violently with the thick, greasy aroma of fried chicken and baked macaroni rolling out from the kitchen. "Come in! Come in! We have been waiting for you," Vivian cooed loudly, practically dragging me into the foyer. I stepped over the threshold and the Steadicam shot would follow me as I took in the overwhelming visual assault of my parents' living room. The house was a monument to their desperate need to appear wealthy. It was stuffed to the brim with fake, ornate antique furniture. Gold-painted plastic mirrors lined the walls, reflecting the light of imitation crystal chandeliers that hung far too low from the ceiling. Oversized, tacky velvet couches dominated the floor space. Every single object in the room was a cheap replica of true luxury, bought on high-interest credit cards by people who prioritized perception over actual peace of mind. The hypocrisy hung in the air, thick and heavy, suffocating everything it touched. Before I could even take my coat off, my younger sister Chloe came practically gliding around the corner from the kitchen. She was holding a crystal wine glass, wearing a tight, inappropriate designer cocktail dress for a casual family dinner. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a smug, self-satisfied expression that she had clearly been practicing all afternoon. Well, look who finally decided to join the real world, Chloe said, stopping a few feet in front of me. She did not offer a hug. Instead, she immediately raised her left hand, pushing her fingers through her hair in a highly exaggerated motion designed entirely to catch the light of the chandelier. Sitting on her ring finger was a massive, blindingly gaudy diamond ring. It was the kind of jewelry that screamed desperation, a fractured cloudy stone surrounded by a cheap halo setting to make it look 3 times its actual value. "Do you like it?" Chloe asked, not even waiting for me to respond before thrusting her hand closer to my face. Chad surprised me with an early anniversary present this morning. He said the wife of a future technology billionaire deserves to wear a rock that matches his upcoming valuation. He is just so incredibly generous, Maya. He really knows how to take care of his family. I looked at the ring, keeping my face perfectly neutral. I knew exactly how that ring had been purchased. My financial intelligence team had been monitoring Chad's credit profiles all weekend. He had opened a brand new high-risk credit line on Friday afternoon just to buy this piece of garbage, further burying himself in consumer debt just to put on a show for me today. "It is certainly hard to miss," I replied smoothly, stepping past her to walk into the living room. Chloe let out a sharp, condescending laugh, immediately pivoting to her favorite defense mechanism, which was aggressively tearing me down to elevate herself. She slowly looked me up and down, her eyes full of judgment as she took in my outfit. I was wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford business suit paired with a crisp white silk blouse and classic stilettos. It was the armor of a woman who commanded respect in boardrooms around the globe. "Are you ever going to stop dressing like a man, Maya?" Chloe asked, taking a slow sip of her wine. "You are coming to a family dinner, not a corporate merger. It is Sunday. You could try looking a little softer, a little more feminine. But I guess when all you care about is hoarding money and intimidating people, you forget how to actually be a woman. Chad was just saying the other day that it is a real tragedy you do not have a man to take care of you. It makes you so rigid and soulless." I stopped in the center of the living room and turned to face her. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the anger she was desperately trying to provoke. I simply looked at her with a profound, terrifying pity. "I dress like a woman who owns the building, Chloe," I said quietly, my voice slicing through the heavy smell of fried food. "And as for being taken care of, I prefer to finance my own life rather than wearing a man's high-interest credit card debt on my finger and calling it love." Chloe's smug smile instantly shattered. The color rushed to her cheeks and her mouth opened in shock, but she could not find a single word to say. She quickly pulled her left hand down, hiding the gaudy ring behind her back, as if the diamond had suddenly caught fire. Before the tension could escalate into a screaming match, the heavy footsteps of Richard echoed from the dining room, followed closely by the arrogant throat-clearing of Chad. The men were making their entrance completely unaware of the psychological demolition that had just occurred in the foyer. The real performance was about to begin, and I walked confidently toward the dining table, ready to hand them the very rope they were begging to hang themselves with. The dining room table was a masterclass in psychological posturing. Chad immediately claimed the head of the table, the seat that had traditionally been reserved for my father. Richard did not object. Instead, my father quietly took a seat on the side, completely surrendering his patriarchal authority in his own home to his white son-in-law. Vivian fluttered around them like a dedicated servant, passing heavy ceramic bowls of baked macaroni and cheese, simmering collard greens and golden fried chicken. She meticulously made sure Chad received the largest portions before anyone else was even allowed to touch the serving spoons. I took the seat at the opposite end of the table, sitting perfectly upright, my tailored suit serving as a stark, unforgiving contrast to the overwhelming mediocrity surrounding me. The moment the plates were filled, Chad cleared his throat effectively, demanding complete silence from the room. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his red wine, and locked his eyes on me with a look of profound condescension. "You know, Maya," he began, his voice dripping with unearned authority. "I was reading a piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning about the gross inefficiencies of traditional asset management. It really made me think about your little real estate operation. You are playing a very old, very dangerous game." I picked up my fork, scooped a small amount of macaroni and cheese, and took a bite. I did not respond. I just chewed slowly, keeping my eyes fixed directly on him. My silence was the green light his massive ego was waiting for. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table, eager to educate the poor, unenlightened black woman about how real money works. "The future of capital is not in physical dirt, Maya," he said, gesturing wildly with his wine glass. "It is about decentralized ecosystems. It is about disrupting archaic paradigms and leveraging blockchain synergies to create frictionless deliverables. You are stuck in a dinosaur industry. Brick and mortar is dying. It is an obsolete economic model built for a generation that did not understand agile frameworks or Web3 integration." Chloe nodded enthusiastically, chewing on a piece of chicken. "Exactly, babe," she chimed in, looking at me with absolute pity. "Chad is creating a digital revolution. You just buy empty buildings and charge people rent. Anyone can be a landlord, Maya. It does not take a genius to sign a lease. You just got lucky that the market went up." Chad chuckled, holding his hand up to gently shush his wife so he could continue his lecture. "What Chloe is trying to say, Maya, is that your business model lacks true scalability. You are burdened by physical depreciation, local zoning politics, and massive tangible liabilities. It is fundamentally unimaginative. I am building a scalable, decentralized architecture that transcends physical boundaries. When my software as a service platform goes public, my valuation will be based on exponential technological potential. Your net worth is entirely dependent on the whims of local housing markets. You are basically just a glorified property manager playing with a lucky market bubble. It is cute that you have done well for yourself considering your background, but you are not playing in the major leagues. Considering your background." There it was. The subtle, quiet racism wrapped tightly in a backhanded compliment. He was telling me that my success was an anomaly, a fluke that happened despite my race and gender, while his imaginary wealth was an inevitable byproduct of his superior intellect. He sat there, a man drowning in consumer debt, using a maxed-out credit card in his mother-in-law's name to lease a luxury vehicle, attempting to lecture a self-made multimillionaire about the fundamentals of high-level finance. I did not defend my empire. I did not explain that Apex Commercial Trust owned the very server farms that hosted his so-called decentralized ecosystem. I did not mention that the physical boundaries he found so unimaginative generated enough liquid cash in a single quarter to buy his entire bloodline 10 times over. I did not tell him that I employ a team of 50 software engineers who actually understand what those buzzwords mean. I simply took another bite of my macaroni and cheese. I chewed it in dead silence, absorbing every single ounce of his breathtaking arrogance. I let his empty Silicon Valley buzzwords bounce harmlessly off my armor. I watched the way Vivian looked at him with blind adoration, completely enamored by his false intelligence and light skin. I watched Richard stare down at his plate, fully aware that Chad was deeply insulting his own daughter, yet too cowardly to speak up and defend me in his own house. My absolute refusal to engage began to shift the energy in the room. Chad expected me to argue. He wanted me to get defensive, to raise my voice, to become the angry, emotional black woman so he could confidently play the calm, rational white man. He needed me to fight back so he could prove his intellectual dominance. When I offered him nothing but a cold, blank stare and the steady clicking of my silver fork against my porcelain plate, his confident smile began to falter ever so slightly. He shifted his weight uncomfortably in his chair. He took a nervous, heavy gulp of his wine. He was pouring all of his psychological ammunition into a solid brick wall, and the sheer lack of reaction was slowly driving him insane. I swallowed my food, dabbed the corners of my mouth with my cloth napkin, and rested my hands gracefully in my lap. "You have a very fascinating perspective on scalability, Chad," I said quietly, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "It takes a very unique mind to view tangible cash-flowing assets as a liability. Please tell me more about this exponential technological potential you are building. I am truly captivated by your vision." I fed his ego the exact validation it was starving for, baiting the trap with surgical precision. I needed him to feel absolutely invincible. I needed him to believe that he had thoroughly dominated me at this dinner table, because the higher he climbed on his pedestal of lies, the harder he was going to hit the concrete when I finally pulled the lever. Chad took the bait completely. He practically beamed with self-satisfaction, interpreting my calm demeanor as complete and utter submission. He thought he had finally broken through my armor and forced me to recognize his inherent superiority. He wiped his mouth with his cloth napkin, stood up from the head of the table, and slowly walked over to a sleek leather briefcase resting on the side buffet. The entire room watched him with bated breath, as if he were a brilliant maestro about to deliver his final stunning crescendo. He snapped the brass locks of the briefcase open. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He carried it back to the table, holding it with both hands, as if it were a sacred religious artifact. He did not sit back down. Instead, he walked all the way over to my end of the table and slammed the folder down onto the polished wood right next to my plate. The sudden noise made Richard flinch, but I did not even blink. I slowly placed my silver fork down and looked up at Chad. "This is the end of the line for your little real estate monopoly, Maya," Chad declared, his voice ringing with absolute triumph. "Inside this folder are the preliminary environmental land survey reports for the Apex Commercial Complex, the exact reports your legal team tried to desperately bury. They detail severe, highly hazardous toxic soil contamination across the entire build site. Contamination that you deliberately hid from the city zoning board and your primary investors by aggressively bribing local environmental inspectors." Chloe gasped dramatically, covering her mouth with her hand. "Oh my God, Chad," she whispered, playing her part perfectly. "Is she going to go to federal prison?" Chad looked at her with a solemn, dramatic nod. "It is a massive federal crime, Chloe. Corporate fraud, environmental negligence, and bribery of public officials. It is the kind of scandal that ends companies and puts executives behind bars for decades." He turned his attention back to me, placing both of his hands flat on the table and leaning directly into my personal space. His breath smelled strongly of cheap red wine and sheer desperation. "I have digital copies of everything in this folder loaded onto a secure offshore server," he whispered, his eyes wide with manic energy. "I have the direct contact information for the regional director of the Environmental Protection Agency, a lead investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and 2 senior investigative journalists at the Wall Street Journal. If I make one single phone call, your construction sites will be swarmed by federal agents before you even finish your morning coffee tomorrow. Your investors will completely panic and pull their capital, and your precious empire will crumble into dust." I looked down at the manila folder. The word "confidential" was stamped across the front in bold red ink. It was a very convincing prop. I knew it was convincing because my own legal department had designed the fake letterheads. "But we are family." Chad continued, his voice suddenly shifting into a sickeningly sweet, magnanimous tone. "And family protects each other even when they make terrible, greedy mistakes. I am willing to completely destroy these files and keep my mouth shut. I am willing to save you from federal prison. But my protection comes with a new price tag." He reached into the inside pocket of his velvet jacket and pulled out a neatly folded legal document. He dropped it directly on top of the manila folder and tapped it twice with his index finger. $5 million in liquid seed capital for my technology startup is no longer going to cut it," he announced loudly, making sure Richard and Vivian heard every single word. "If I am going to risk my own pristine reputation to cover up your federal crimes, I need to be properly compensated. You are going to sign a legally binding contract tonight, transferring $5 million into my corporate account by tomorrow morning. Furthermore, you are going to sign over 20% equity of Apex Commercial Trust directly to me." I stared at the document. 20%. He was not just trying to extort cash from me anymore. He was trying to steal a massive controlling stake in the empire I had spent 19 years building. He wanted to instantly become a multimillionaire off my blood and sweat, using a fake dossier he bought from a degenerate gambler. "I will join your board of directors," Chad explained, pacing back and forth behind my chair. "I will use my 20% equity to modernize your archaic infrastructure. I will implement the scalable software solutions you so desperately need. In a way, I am actually saving your company from its own outdated leadership. You should be thanking me, Maya." I did not reach for the pen he placed next to the contract. I simply sat there in total silence. My lack of immediate compliance triggered a furious reaction from the other side of the table. Vivian slammed her hands down on the table, rattling the silverware. She glared at me with absolute disgust, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of deep jealousy and righteous rage. "Do not you dare sit there and act like a victim," Maya Vivian shouted, her voice shrill and piercing. "You brought this entirely on yourself with your arrogant, selfish greed. I knew there was something dirty about how fast you made all that money. No honest black woman builds an empire that big without cutting corners and breaking the law. You have embarrassed this family for the absolute last time." She stood up, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Chad is offering you a generous lifeline. He is stepping up as the man of this family to clean up your disgusting mess. You owe him everything. You owe your sister everything. You are going to pick up that pen right now and you are going to sign that contract. You are going to finally do something right for this family instead of just hoarding your dirty money and looking down your nose at us." Richard remained seated, refusing to meet my eyes. He just stared at his plate of cold food, occasionally nodding along with Vivian's screaming. He was watching a man try to steal his daughter's life work, and his only response was sheer cowardice. "If you walk out of this house without signing that paper," Vivian threatened, her voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper, "I swear to God I will help Chad pack those documents into a box and mail them to the FBI myself. I will testify against you in open court. I will tell the judge exactly what kind of ruthless lying monster you really are. You will have no family, no company, and no money. You will be absolutely nothing." The dining room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the low humming of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the rapid, excited breathing of Chloe, who was practically vibrating with anticipation in her chair. They had played their absolute best cards. They had cornered me in my childhood home, surrounded me with threats of federal prison, and demanded the keys to my kingdom. They genuinely believed they had me completely trapped. They thought the cold, silent look on my face was sheer terror. They had absolutely no idea I was just waiting for the perfect moment to drop the match. I did not break eye contact with Vivian as her screams faded into the heavy fried chicken-scented air of the dining room. I let my silence stretch, allowing the sheer weight of their collective greed to settle over the table. I needed them to see exactly what they wanted to see. I needed them to believe that their coordinated ambush had completely broken my spirit. I slowly lowered my eyes to the table, deliberately letting my shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch. It was a subtle, microscopic shift in my posture, but in the high-stakes game of psychological warfare, it was the universal white flag of surrender. I slowly reached out and placed my hand on top of the legal contract Chad had aggressively thrown in front of me. I let my fingers trace the edge of the thick paper. I took a deep, shaky breath, carefully manufacturing a look of profound defeat. I looked up at Chad, allowing my eyes to widen just enough to mimic the frantic desperation of a cornered animal. "This is a massive decision, Chad," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound slightly hollow and unsteady. "You are asking for 20% of my life's work. You are asking for $5 million in liquid capital. I cannot just sign this blindly at a dinner table. My legal team needs to review the liability clauses, and I need to restructure my quarterly asset allocations to free up that kind of cash without triggering a board audit. Let me think about it until your startup launch party this weekend. I will bring the signed documents and the certified check to the country club." The transformation in the room was absolutely instantaneous. The thick, suffocating tension evaporated completely, replaced by a sickening wave of victorious euphoria. Chad let out a loud, obnoxious bark of laughter. He slapped the wooden dining table with his palm, his face glowing with the supreme arrogant satisfaction of a mediocre man who genuinely believed he had just outsmarted a titan. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his cheap red wine, and pointed a condescending finger at me. "Now that is the smart analytical Maya we all know and love," Chad said, his voice dripping with slimy, magnanimous praise. "Take your time, Maya. Have your lawyers look it over. They will tell you it is an airtight agreement. I am actually doing you a massive favor here. By Sunday night, we are going to be equal partners. We are going to take your archaic little real estate firm and turn it into a global technology powerhouse. Just do not be late to the party." Vivian let out a long theatrical sigh of relief. She dramatically pressed her hand against her chest, acting as if she had just successfully brokered world peace. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet maternal smile that made my skin crawl. "I am so incredibly proud of you," Maya Vivian cooed softly. "You are finally putting your family first. You are finally learning how to share your blessings. When you walk into that launch party on Saturday, you will not just be my wealthy, isolated daughter anymore. You will truly be part of this family again. The Lord is going to reward your generosity, I promise you that." Even Chloe chimed in, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. She flashed her gaudy, debt-financed diamond ring at me one more time. "Welcome to the winning team, sis," she sneered playfully. "Chad is going to make you so much richer than those boring old buildings ever could." Richard finally lifted his head from his plate. He offered me a weak, cowardly nod of approval, clearly relieved that he would not have to deal with his wife screaming for the rest of the evening. I did not offer them a smile in return. I simply stood up from the table, grabbed my designer clutch, and politely excused myself. I walked out of the dining room, moving with the slow, defeated gait of a woman who had just lost her entire empire. I let Vivian walk me to the front door, enduring one final, suffocating hug. She patted my back, whispering about how excited she was for the weekend. I stepped out onto the porch, and the heavy oak door finally clicked shut behind me. The moment the deadbolt slid into place, the mask fell completely off my face. I walked down the concrete path toward my car. The humid Atlanta night air washed over me instantly, clearing the toxic stench of their hypocrisy from my lungs. I unlocked my custom black sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door, sealing myself inside the absolute soundproof silence of my vehicle. I did not start the engine immediately. I just sat there in the dark. The camera would zoom in incredibly tight on my face right now, framing my reflection in the rearview mirror. Slowly, a cold, terrifying, genuinely sociopathic smile spread across my face. It was the smile of an apex predator that had just successfully lured its prey into a steel trap. They had absolutely no idea. They had no idea that the environmental documents were fake. They had no idea that I owned the bank that held the mortgage on the very house they were celebrating in. They had completely taken the bait. I reached over and pressed a button on my dashboard, connecting my phone to the car's secure Bluetooth system. I dialed a highly encrypted number. The phone rang exactly twice before a sharp professional voice answered on the other end. "Good evening, Ms. Maya, my chief financial officer," Elias said briskly. "Elias, wake up the acquisitions team," I commanded, my voice completely stripped of the fake desperation I had used inside the house. My tone was pure, unfiltered ice. "I need you to initiate a hostile, untraceable buyout of every single outstanding debt currently attached to Chad's name. I am talking about his fraudulent technology startup, his personal credit cards, his auto loans, and his venture capital margins. Buy it all through our offshore shell corporations. Pay whatever premium the creditors demand. I want Apex Commercial Trust to own 100% of his financial existence by Friday afternoon." "Understood," Elias replied without a single moment of hesitation. "And once the debts are fully acquired and transferred to our holding accounts, what are your orders regarding the repayment schedules?" My smile widened, my eyes gleaming in the dark cabin of the car. "The second the ink dries on those transfers, I want you to trigger the immediate recall clauses on every single loan, I said smoothly. Call in the entire principal amounts. Give him absolutely zero time to restructure. I want him completely legally and financially paralyzed by the time he steps up to the microphone at his little launch party this weekend. Have the litigation team draft the seizure documents and send them directly to my secure tablet. I will be delivering the foreclosure notices personally. Consider it done, Ms. Maya Elias said, before quietly disconnecting the line. I placed both hands on the leather steering wheel, the adrenaline finally rushing through my veins. Chad wanted to play the role of the brilliant, ruthless corporate raider. He wanted to use my family to extort me for 20% of my kingdom. He wanted a public spectacle. This weekend at the most exclusive country club in Atlanta, surrounded by the wealthy elite he so desperately wanted to impress, I was going to give him exactly the public spectacle he asked for. I started the engine, the powerful motor roaring to life in the quiet suburban neighborhood, and drove off into the night to prepare for the slaughter. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp, clear sky, the perfect backdrop for a high society slaughter. I pulled up to the grand entrance of the Oakmont Country Club, the most exclusive, heavily guarded private club in the greater Atlanta area. The sprawling estate was glowing with warm golden light, surrounded by acres of perfectly manicured golf greens and ancient oak trees. This was a place where old money and new technology collided, a sanctuary for the ultra-wealthy elite. And tonight, Chad had somehow managed to rent out the main ballroom to host the official launch party for his completely worthless startup. I handed my keys to the valet and stepped out of my car wearing a breathtaking floor-length crimson gown that demanded absolute attention. I walked through the heavy double doors and stepped into the grand foyer, instantly immersed in the loud, buzzing energy of the event. The room was packed with wealthy investors, local politicians, and members of the financial press holding flashing cameras. Waiters navigated through the sea of expensive suits and designer dresses, balancing silver trays of champagne and caviar. It was a spectacular, incredibly expensive illusion. I knew exactly how Chad had funded this lavish party. He had maxed out 2 of the corporate credit lines I had secretly purchased just 48 hours ago. He was literally partying on my dime, completely oblivious to the fact that the financial guillotine was already hovering right above his neck. I slowly made my way through the crowded ballroom, nodding politely to several prominent real estate developers and banking executives who recognized me. They looked slightly confused to see the chief executive officer of Apex Commercial Trust at a mid-level tech launch, but they assumed I was there scouting a potential acquisition. I found a quiet spot near the back of the room and turned my attention to the main stage. There was Chad standing directly under a bright spotlight, holding a microphone, and pacing back and forth like he was a visionary genius. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue suit, his hair perfectly styled, radiating the sickeningly arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had successfully blackmailed a multimillionaire. Behind him, a massive digital screen displayed the sleek, meaningless logo of his company. He was deep into his keynote speech, passionately lecturing the crowd of wealthy investors about his revolutionary decentralized ecosystem. He threw around empty Silicon Valley buzzwords with total conviction, talking about blockchain integration, seamless scalability, and disrupting the traditional financial paradigms. The press cameras flashed brightly, capturing every moment of his manufactured glory. He genuinely believed he was standing on the precipice of absolute greatness. He looked out at the audience, soaking in their polite attention, completely convinced that he was the smartest man in the entire room. As Chad began wrapping up his ridiculous presentation, I felt a heavy, familiar hand grasp my right elbow. I turned and saw Vivian, Richard, and Chloe materializing out of the crowd, forming a tight, inescapable semicircle around me. They had been watching the entrance all night, waiting for me to arrive like a pack of starving wolves. Vivian was wearing an overly dramatic sequined dress, her face glowing with greedy anticipation. She leaned in close, the smell of her heavy floral perfume completely overpowering the scent of the expensive catering. "I am so glad you finally made it," Maya Vivian whispered, her voice dripping with fake, sickening sweetness. "We were starting to worry you got cold feet. I hope you brought the signed contracts and the certified check like we discussed. Chad has been telling the press all night that a major institutional investor is about to join his board of directors. You are about to make this family very wealthy tonight." Chloe stood next to her, clutching a fresh glass of champagne, her gaudy, debt-financed diamond ring catching the chandelier light. She looked me up and down, offering a condescending little smirk. "Do not look so nervous, sis," Chloe said playfully. "Just go up there, hand him the folder, and smile for the cameras. Chad is going to take it from here. You finally get to be a part of something truly revolutionary." Even Richard chimed in, leaning forward to offer his cowardly words of encouragement. "You are doing the right thing, Maya," he murmured softly. "This is going to heal our family once and for all. This is how you secure your legacy." They did not give me a chance to respond. As the crowd erupted into polite applause for the end of Chad's speech, Vivian aggressively grabbed my arm and began physically guiding me through the sea of wealthy guests, pushing me directly toward the front edge of the stage. On the stage, Chad raised his hands to quiet the applause, an enormous victorious smile spreading across his face as he made direct eye contact with me. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Chad announced loudly, his voice echoing powerfully through the massive ballroom speakers, "it is my absolute honor to introduce the final piece of our corporate puzzle, the person who is going to help take this company to a global scale. Please welcome the founder of Apex Commercial Trust, a woman who is not just an industry titan, but also my beloved sister-in-law, Maya." The crowd erupted into a second, much louder wave of applause. The prominent investors in the room suddenly leaned forward, highly intrigued by the prospect of my massive corporate backing. The press photographers instantly swarmed the edge of the stage, their camera flashes blinding me. A stagehand rushed over and thrust a wireless microphone directly into my hand. Vivian gave me one final hard shove in the middle of my back, forcing me to step up the small set of stairs and onto the brightly lit stage. I walked toward the center, my crimson gown flowing elegantly behind me, a heavy red legal folder clutched firmly in my left hand. Chad stepped forward to meet me, opening his arms for a theatrical, deeply fake embrace. He leaned his head next to my ear, whispering through a clenched, victorious smile, "Hand over the check, Maya, and smile for the cameras. You belong to me now." I pulled back, looked at the heavy microphone in my hand, and then looked out at the sea of expectant faces, waiting for my $5 million announcement. I took a slow, deep breath, raised the microphone to my lips, and prepared to burn his entire world to the ground. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. Hundreds of the wealthiest individuals in Atlanta were staring directly at me, holding their breath, waiting for the announcement of a massive corporate merger. If someone had been filming this for a documentary, this is the exact moment the camera operator would have switched off the smooth, stabilizing equipment. The visual style would violently shift to a raw, handheld perspective, perfectly capturing the chaotic, unscripted reality of a beautifully orchestrated disaster unfolding in real time. The lens would shake ever so slightly, zooming in quickly on the sweat suddenly forming on Chad's forehead, as I stood there without speaking for just a second too long. Chad nudged my shoulder, his fake smile freezing in place. "Go ahead, Maya," he whispered, the microphone picking up the faint, desperate hiss of his voice. "Tell them about the $5 million. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes focused firmly on the sea of prominent investors and journalists standing before the stage. I raised my left hand and slowly opened the heavy red legal folder. There was no oversized presentation check inside. There were no congratulatory partnership agreements. Instead, I pulled out a thick stack of formal legal documents. Every single page was aggressively stamped in bright red ink with the words certified foreclosure and immediate asset seizure. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing with crystal clear precision through the massive speakers. "It is a profound honor to stand before so many distinguished members of the Atlanta financial community. Chad has spent the last hour painting a beautiful picture of a decentralized technological ecosystem. He has used a tremendous amount of impressive vocabulary tonight to ask for your capital. But as the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Commercial Trust, I have an ethical obligation to ensure that the integrity of our financial community remains completely untarnished. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the room, making direct eye contact with the very billionaires Chad had been trying to impress all evening. Therefore, I continued, my tone dropping to a cold, authoritative cadence. It is my duty to inform you that there will be no $5 million investment tonight. In fact, there is no technology company at all. After a thorough forensic audit conducted by my Financial Intelligence Division, I can officially confirm that Chad's highly publicized startup is nothing more than an empty shell company specifically designed for aggressive money laundering and wire fraud. The reaction was instantaneous and deafening. A collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. The polite, hushed atmosphere shattered into a million pieces. The flashing of the press cameras suddenly doubled in speed, the rapid clicking sounding like a swarm of locusts. Several high-profile investors immediately dropped their champagne glasses onto the marble floor, the shattering crystal adding to the sudden explosive chaos. Chad stumbled backward, as if I had physically struck him across the face. His jaw dropped open and all the arrogant color rapidly drained from his cheeks. "Maya, what are you doing?" he stammered, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Turn off the microphone. This is a joke. Tell them this is a joke right now." I did not step back. I stepped forward, dominating the center of the stage, holding the red-stamped documents high in the air for the press photographers to capture clearly. "This is not a joke," I announced, speaking firmly over the rising roar of the confused and angry crowd. Every single buzzword you heard tonight was a carefully constructed lie to hide a massive mountain of toxic debt. The man standing behind me has zero proprietary software. He has zero patents. He does not have a single legitimate engineer on his payroll. What he does have is a long documented history of defrauding independent investors to fund his own lavish lifestyle. He has been taking venture capital seed money and funneling it directly into offshore accounts to pay off his staggering personal credit card debts, including the very catering and rental fees for this lavish party you are attending tonight. Down in the front row, I could see Vivian and Chloe completely frozen in shock. Chloe had both hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror as the wealthy socialites around her physically stepped away, treating her like she was suddenly contagious. Vivienne was shaking her head frantically, desperately looking around the room as her meticulously crafted illusion of high society prestige was brutally torn to shreds in front of the entire city. Chad lunged forward, desperately trying to grab the microphone out of my hand. "Security!" he screamed into the crowd, his voice high and frantic. "Get her off the stage. She is lying. She is a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin my reputation." I effortlessly sidestepped his clumsy grab. Two massive private security guards men who were technically on my payroll because I owned the private security firm contracted by the country club stepped onto the edge of the stage and crossed their arms silently, daring Chad to make another move toward me. Chad froze, realizing he was completely unprotected. "He is attempting to call security to throw me out," I said into the microphone, shaking my head in mock pity. But unfortunately for Chad, his financial leverage has completely run out. In a desperate attempt to keep this fraudulent company afloat and maintain his fraudulent lifestyle, he recently took out a massive high-interest corporate loan. He quietly leveraged 100% of his equity, his personal assets, and his intellectual property rights as collateral to the Apex Investment Fund. The murmurs in the crowd grew into a frenzy. The financial journalists in the room were rapidly typing on their phones, recognizing the name of the massive hedge fund. They knew exactly what it meant to be fully leveraged to an aggressive institutional lender. "That is right," I said, my voice cutting through the noise like a scythe. "He bet his entire non-existent empire on borrowed money. He mortgaged his fake technology, his reputation, and his freedom to a faceless corporate entity, hoping he could extort enough money tonight to cover his tracks before the federal authorities noticed the massive discrepancies in his accounting. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he could manipulate the market, manipulate this community, and manipulate my family. I turned my head slightly, looking directly at Chad, who was now visibly trembling his velvet suit, looking suddenly oversized and ridiculous on his shrinking frame. He was staring at the red folders in my hand, the horrifying reality of his situation finally crashing down on his massive ego. He was completely exposed, stripped of his white privilege, his corporate jargon, and his fake wealth. He had absolutely nowhere to run. Chad's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He thrust a trembling finger toward my face, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to reclaim control of the narrative. "This is slander!" he screamed, his voice cracking violently over the ambient noise of the ballroom. "She is lying to all of you. This is defamation of character. I am going to sue you for every single penny you have, Maya. I am going to drag you through the courts until you are absolutely bankrupt. You cannot just stand up here and spread malicious lies because you are jealous of my success." I did not back away from his pointing finger. Instead, I let out a slow, cold laugh. It was a dark, hollow sound that echoed through the microphone and sent a visible chill through the front rows of the audience. The flashing cameras caught the exact moment my smile reached its sharpest, most terrifying angle. "Are you planning to pay your elite lawyers with the corporate credit cards I canceled 2 hours ago?" Chad, I asked smoothly. "Or perhaps you were planning to use the venture capital funds that no longer exist?" Chad sneered at me, trying to stand tall despite the visible shaking in his knees. "My venture capital is secured through the Apex Investment Fund," he spat, looking out at the investors as if begging for their validation. "It is an ironclad contract. You cannot touch it. My legal team will have you behind bars for this stunt." I slowly shook my head. My eyes locked onto his panicked, sweating face. "That is where you are completely wrong, Chad. You see, the Apex Investment Fund is indeed a formidable financial institution, but they are also highly pragmatic. When my acquisitions team approached them early yesterday morning with an incredibly generous above-market cash offer to purchase their entire distressed technology debt portfolio, they did not hesitate. The board of directors signed the transfer papers at exactly 9 o'clock this morning." I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice so the microphone picked up the quiet, lethal intensity of my words. "I bought Apex this morning. I own the fund. I own the collateral. I own every single piece of debt attached to your name. Congratulations, Chad. You are no longer a chief executive officer. You are my personal debtor. And as of 10 minutes ago, I triggered the immediate recall clauses on all of your loans. You are financially ruined." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the wooden podium to keep himself from collapsing onto the stage. The wealthy investors in the crowd were completely silent, watching a masterclass in ruthless corporate warfare unfold right before their eyes. Chad's chest was rising and falling rapidly. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for any possible escape route. Then, in a final pathetic act of absolute desperation, he reached into the inside pocket of his velvet jacket. He pulled out the folded legal contract and the fake environmental dossier he had tried to blackmail me with at Sunday dinner. He held the thick stack of papers up, waving them frantically at the journalists standing in the front row. "She is corrupt," Chad yelled, his voice shrill and desperate, completely losing any remaining shred of his composure. "Do not listen to her. She is a corporate criminal. I have the proof right here. She bribed city officials to hide massive toxic soil contamination at her new commercial complex. She is trying to destroy me because I refuse to keep her dirty secrets. I have the highly confidential zoning documents to prove she is committing federal fraud." The journalists immediately raised their cameras, zooming in on the papers in his shaking hand. A murmur of genuine concern rippled through the investors. This was exactly what Chad had threatened to do, and he genuinely believed this was his ultimate, unbeatable trump card. He looked at me with a wild, triumphant gleam in his eyes, believing he had just leveled the playing field and saved his reputation. I simply smiled. I reached into my own red folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and handed it directly to the closest financial reporter standing at the edge of the stage. "Go ahead and read those documents closely, Chad," I said, my voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Read the file numbers printed at the bottom of those pages. Then ask yourself how a disgruntled environmental inspector managed to get his hands on highly confidential corporate files that had never even been submitted to the city zoning board." Chad frantically opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages as his hands shook uncontrollably. The triumphant gleam in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, sinking terror. "You really thought you outsmarted me?" I continued, addressing the entire room, while keeping my eyes fixed on my brother-in-law. "You thought you discovered my deepest, darkest corporate secret. But you are not a genius, Chad. You are just remarkably predictable. That zoning dossier you tried to blackmail me with is completely fabricated. There is no toxic soil. There is no bribery. My legal team drafted those fake documents 3 weeks ago on a secure, isolated server. I took one final step toward him, delivering the absolute killing blow. I leaked those fake drafts to you myself, Chad. I planted that encrypted flash drive with one of your heavily indebted poker buddies, knowing exactly how fast you would snatch it up. I needed to see exactly how far your greed, your desperate need for validation, and your arrogant sense of entitlement would push you. I handed you the rope, and you eagerly tied the noose around your own neck. The heavy folder slipped out of Chad's hands, the fake documents fluttering and scattering across the polished wooden floor of the stage. He fell to his knees, his perfectly tailored velvet suit suddenly looking like a tragic, ridiculous costume. The crowd erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers and frantic phone calls. The brilliant tech visionary of Atlanta was gone, completely erased from existence in less than 5 minutes, leaving behind nothing but a broken, weeping fraud on the floor of a country club. The sharp sound of Chad sobbing on the floor was suddenly interrupted by a piercing, hysterical scream from the front row. Chloe broke through the line of stunned investors and charged up the wooden stairs of the stage. Her heavily sequined designer dress caught the harsh glare of the spotlight as she threw herself between me and her pathetic, kneeling husband. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with a manic, unhinged fury. She was completely oblivious to the reality of the situation, still desperately clinging to the delusion that she could somehow bully her way out of this nightmare. "You evil, jealous witch!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing violently through the ballroom and causing several guests in the front row to physically wince. "You are ruining him. You are ruining my billionaire husband just because you are miserable and alone. You have always been jealous of me. You have always hated that Mom and Dad loved me more. You are making all of this up to destroy my perfect life, and I am going to have you arrested for harassment." She stood there, chest-heaving, makeup running down her face, screaming at the top of her lungs in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. I did not step back. I did not call my security team to physically remove her. I simply stood perfectly still, letting the silence of the room amplify her unhinged meltdown. I wanted the press cameras to capture every single second of her absolute delusion. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I slowly shook my head, looking at her with a mixture of profound disgust and chilling pity. "Billionaire husband," I repeated softly, the microphone carrying my dry, mocking tone across the silent room. "Chloe, your husband does not even have enough liquid cash to validate his parking ticket tonight. And frankly, neither do you." Chloe sneered instinctively, raising her left hand to flash the massive cloudy diamond ring Chad had given her. "You are just jealous of my lifestyle," she spat defensively, though her voice was starting to waver. "Chad buys me whatever I want. He treats me like absolute royalty. We are going to bounce back from this ridiculous little stunt of yours, and you are going to be completely cut out of our massive fortune forever." "That is a fascinating theory," I said smoothly, stepping out from behind the podium to fully face her. "But it brings us to a very interesting question. If Chad has been funneling all of his stolen venture capital into offshore accounts to hide it from the federal government, how exactly did you afford that $30,000 ring on your finger? How did you afford that custom sequined dress you are wearing right now? How did you pay for your lavish 3-week vacation to the Maldives last month? Chloe opened her mouth to speak, ready to proudly declare that her husband was a generous provider, but her confidence suddenly faltered. A flicker of genuine panic flashed across her eyes. I did not give her a chance to invent another lie. I reached back into my heavy red legal folder and pulled out a second stack of documents. These were not corporate foreclosure notices stamped in red ink. They were thick, detailed financial statements printed directly from a premier international banking institution. I walked over to the wooden podium in the center of the stage and forcefully slammed the stack of papers down. I spread them out in a wide arc, making sure the financial journalists standing at the edge of the stage could clearly see the highlighted account numbers, the forged signatures, and the heavily itemized transaction lists. You see, I announced to the crowd, my voice echoing with absolute authority, when my financial intelligence team began unwinding Chad's web of corporate fraud. They stumbled across a highly irregular network of personal credit lines. Dozens of premium high-limit credit cards opened in the last 18 months. But they were not opened under Chad's name. And they were certainly not opened under your name, Chloe, because your personal credit score was completely decimated 5 years ago when you defaulted on your student loans. I shifted my gaze away from my sister and looked directly down into the audience, locking eyes with my mother. Vivian was still standing in the front row, clutching her cheap knockoff handbag, looking completely lost and terrified. She was staring up at me, her mouth slightly open, waiting for a punchline that was never going to come. "Mother," I said, dropping the theatrical volume and adopting a sharp, piercing clarity that cut straight to her core. "Do you remember when you complained at Sunday dinner that the bank denied your application to refinance the house? Do you remember telling Dad that there must have been some kind of administrative error on your credit report because you always paid your bills on time?" Vivian's face went completely pale. She slowly nodded, her eyes darting nervously between me, Chloe, and the financial statements scattered across the podium. "No," Vivian whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maya, what are you saying? Chloe would never do anything to hurt me." "There was no administrative error," I told her, mercilessly refusing to let her hide behind her denial any longer. "Your youngest daughter, your absolute golden child, the girl you stole my college fund to protect 19 years ago, stole your social security number. She committed aggravated identity theft against her own mother." I picked up the top statement and read directly from it, making sure every single person in the room heard the exact details of the betrayal. A platinum rewards card opened in Vivian's name, maxed out at $45,000. The primary charges include a custom designer wardrobe, first-class tickets to Dubai, and daily luxury spa treatments. I picked up a second sheet of paper and held it up. A premier travel account maxed out at $60,000. The charges include high-end interior decorating for an apartment Chloe does not even own, and a massive non-refundable down payment on Chad's Porsche. I dropped the paper back onto the podium. I looked at Chloe, who was now visibly shrinking under the harsh spotlight. Her manic fury was completely gone, replaced by pure, paralyzing guilt. She took a step backward, desperately trying to avoid looking at the front row where our mother stood. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very small and incredibly foolish. "Your billionaire husband did not buy you that ring, Chloe," I said coldly, pointing directly at the gaudy diamond on her shaking hand. "You bought it yourself using a fraudulent credit card in your mother's name. You intercepted the bank mail. You set up fake email accounts to divert the electronic statements. You funded your entire fake luxurious lifestyle by secretly draining Vivian's credit profile, completely destroying her financial future in the process. You pushed your own parents into massive, unrecoverable debt, just so you could post glamorous pictures on the internet and pretend you were better than everyone else." A loud, heartbroken wail erupted from the front row. Vivian dropped her handbag onto the marble floor. Her hands flew up to clutch her face, her carefully manicured facade completely shattering into a million pieces. The mother who had spent her entire life shielding Chloe from the consequences of her actions. The woman who had proudly enabled her toxic behavior and constantly prioritized her over me was finally realizing the catastrophic cost of her blind favoritism. She had been brutally, systematically betrayed and financially ruined by the only child she ever truly loved. The silence that followed my revelation was so profound, you could hear the soft whirring of the camera lenses adjusting their focus. Vivienne stood completely frozen, her eyes darting between the thick stack of financial statements on the podium and the terrified, shrinking figure of her youngest daughter. For 19 years, Vivienne had built her entire identity around the absolute perfection of her golden child. She had sacrificed my future, drained my college fund, and abandoned me in the dark just to ensure Chloe never had to face a single consequence. And now, the ultimate consequence had arrived, delivered directly by the daughter she had thrown away. Vivienne took a slow, unsteady step toward the stage. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sickening wet sound that echoed in the quiet ballroom. She looked at Chloe, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and rising, uncontrollable rage. "Tell me she is lying," Vivienne pleaded, her voice cracking. "Tell me you did not steal my identity. Tell me you did not ruin my life for a dress and a vacation." Chloe backed away, her hands shaking as she tried to pull her sequined dress tighter around her body. "Mom, please, you have to understand," Chloe stammered, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face. "Chad's business was just about to take off. We needed to maintain an image. We had to look the part so the investors would take us seriously. I was going to pay you back. I swear the second the venture capital came through, I was going to pay off every single card." The confession hung in the air, heavy and absolutely devastating. It was not a denial. It was a pathetic, self-serving justification. Vivienne did not say another word. She lunged forward with a sudden, explosive burst of energy that took everyone by surprise. She raised her right hand and brought it across Chloe's face with a vicious, resounding slap. The sharp crack echoed through the grand ballroom like a gunshot. Chloe let out a sharp cry, stumbling backward and clutching her rapidly reddening cheek. She looked at our mother in absolute shock, as if she could not comprehend that the woman who had spent a lifetime protecting her had just struck her in front of hundreds of people. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat," Vivienne screamed, completely losing her mind. The heavy floral perfume she wore could not mask the sudden sour smell of her absolute panic. "I gave you everything. I sacrificed my own flesh and blood to keep you safe. I defended you to everyone. And you stole my name. You stole my future. You pushed me into bankruptcy for a diamond ring." The family unit was officially disintegrating, collapsing inward under the crushing weight of their own greed and lies. Chad, who was still kneeling on the floor of the stage, surrounded by his fake environmental documents, realized that his wife had just admitted to federal identity theft on a hot microphone in a room full of journalists. His instinct for self-preservation kicked in instantly. He scrambled to his feet, holding his hands up defensively, and immediately threw the woman he supposedly loved directly under the bus. "I had absolutely nothing to do with that," Chad shouted, his voice shrill and panicked as he backed away from Chloe. "I thought she came from money. She told me her parents were setting up a trust fund for us. I did not know she was opening fraudulent credit cards. She is crazy. She acted completely alone." Chloe whipped her head around, staring at her husband with wide, betrayed eyes. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "You knew exactly where that money was coming from. You told me to do it. You said we needed the capital to lease the Porsche. You said your parents would cut you off if they knew you were broke. You are a liar and a coward." The two of them began screaming at each other, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, vicious symphony of blame and betrayal. They hurled insults, exposed each other's deepest insecurities, and aired every single piece of dirty laundry they had right there on the stage. The elite investors in the audience were watching in stunned silence, completely captivated by the grotesque spectacle. The financial journalists were recording every single second of the meltdown, their camera flashes illuminating the absolute destruction of Chad and Chloe's fake empire. It was a feeding frenzy, and my family was tearing themselves apart to avoid being eaten alive. I stood behind the podium watching the carnage with complete emotional detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. They had brought this entirely on themselves. They had constructed a house of cards out of arrogance and entitlement, and I simply provided the breeze that knocked it all down. Suddenly, a heavy hand slammed down on the wooden podium right next to the scattered credit card statements. I looked to my left and saw my father, Richard. He had finally climbed onto the stage. His face was a deep, dangerous shade of purple, and the veins in his neck were bulging. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were completely white. But he was not looking at Chad. He was not looking at Chloe, who was currently weeping and screaming at her husband. He was not looking at Vivian, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. He was looking directly at me. In the twisted, cowardly mind of my father, the real villain was not the daughter who committed identity theft, or the son-in-law who committed wire fraud and extortion. The real villain was the woman who turned on the lights and exposed the cockroaches. He could not handle the public humiliation, so he directed all of his explosive, impotent rage at the only person who had ever held them accountable. "You did this!" Richard snarled, his voice a low, terrifying growl that was picked up perfectly by the microphone. "You orchestrated this entire circus just to humiliate us. You could have handled this quietly. You could have come to us in private. But no, you wanted a spectacle. You wanted to stand up here like a god and destroy your own sister. You wanted to watch your mother cry. You are sick, Maya. You have a cold black heart and you are absolutely sick." I met his furious gaze without blinking. "I handled it exactly the way you taught me to handle things 19 years ago," I replied smoothly. "I left you all in the dark to figure it out." Richard raised his shaking finger, pointing at inches from my face. He was vibrating with a toxic mixture of shame and fury. "You listen to me very carefully." He spat, his voice trembling with venom. "You are no daughter of mine. From this moment on, you are completely dead to me. You have completely disgraced the family name. I never want to see your face again. I never want to hear your voice again. And if you ever try to step foot inside my house again, I will personally call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. Do you understand me? You are banned from my house forever." The crowd gasped at the sheer cruelty of his words. A father publicly disowning his child on a lit stage was a level of drama even the ruthless elite of Atlanta rarely witnessed. He thought his words were the ultimate punishment. He thought banning me from the family home was the most devastating weapon he possessed. He genuinely believed he was taking away the last piece of my family identity. He had absolutely no idea that he had just set up the greatest punchline of my entire life. I stood perfectly still as the echo of his furious threat faded into the cavernous ceiling of the grand ballroom, banned from his house, arrested for trespassing. The sheer breathtaking poetry of his ignorance was almost too beautiful to interrupt. I looked down at the man who had cowered behind his wife for my entire life. A man whose entire patriarchal identity was built on a fragile foundation of lies, fake antique furniture, and leased property. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I did not even frown. Instead, I simply smiled. It was a slow, terrifying, deeply genuine smile that caused Richard to instinctively stop breathing and take a half step backward. His house. I raised the microphone back to my lips, the smooth, black metal feeling like a weapon in my hand. I let out a soft, dry chuckle that sent a visible ripple of tension through the crowd of investors. "Your house." "Richard?" I asked, my voice echoing with a calm, lethal curiosity. "That is a very fascinating choice of words. You speak with such incredible authority about that beautiful brick colonial home. You act as if you are the lord of a great manor protecting your sacred family estate from a trespassing stranger." I reached my left hand into the very back of my heavy red legal folder. There was exactly one final piece of paper remaining. It was not a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition contract. It was not a premium credit card statement exposing identity theft. It was a simple standard legal form, printed on crisp white paper with a bold black header. I pulled it out and held it by the corner. "Let us talk about your house," I continued, my eyes locked dead onto his terrified face. 19 years ago, you and Vivian drained my college savings and abandoned me in that exact same house while the bank was actively foreclosing on it. You ran away from your debts and left a 16-year-old girl sitting in the freezing dark with nothing but an empty pantry and a yellow sticky note. But somehow, miraculously, a few years later, you managed to scrape together just enough credit to move back into that neighborhood. You spent the next decade parading around the suburbs, hosting your lavish Sunday dinners, and pretending you were a wealthy, successful patriarch. Richard was staring at the single piece of paper in my hand. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The purple rage had completely drained from his face, replaced by the pale, sickly color of a man realizing he was standing on a trapdoor. "But financial habits never really change, do they?" I said smoothly, stepping right to the edge of the stage, towering directly over him. 3 years ago, Vivian's desperate need to keep up appearances finally caught up with your mortgage payments. You defaulted. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings for the second time. You were weeks away from having your fake antique furniture thrown out onto the front lawn in full view of your entire church congregation. You were absolutely terrified of the public humiliation. I paused, letting the silence wrap around his throat. But then a miracle happened, I announced to the completely captivated ballroom. A private, anonymous real estate holding company swooped in at the absolute last second. They bought the bad debt directly from the bank. They took the deed to the house and they generously offered you a standard residential lease. They allowed you to stay in the home as everyday renters, ensuring that none of your wealthy neighbors ever found out you had lost everything. You signed that lease, Richard. You have been paying rent to a faceless corporate landlord for 3 years, pretending you still owned the kingdom. Richard was physically shaking now. His hands hung limply at his sides. He slowly shook his head, his eyes pleading with me to stop talking, realizing exactly where this was going, but entirely powerless to prevent the final blow. "I am sure you know where this is going, Richard," I whispered softly into the microphone. "That anonymous holding company is a direct subsidiary of Apex Commercial Trust. I own the holding company. I own the deed. I own the walls, the roof, the manicured lawn, and the driveway where you park your leased cars. You do not have a house to ban me from." I raised the crisp, white piece of paper high in the air. "This is not a corporate merger," I declared, my voice ringing with finality. "This is a formal, legally binding notice of eviction. Because while you were sitting at my dining room table last night eating food cooked in my kitchen, demanding I give this fraudulent tech bro $5 million of my hard-earned money, you were actively ignoring the fact that you are currently 3 months behind on your rent?" Richard let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. Vivian, who was still kneeling on the floor next to Chloe, let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She scrambled towards the edge of the stage, her hands reaching up toward me as if she could somehow rewind time and take back every terrible thing she had ever done. "Maya." "Please," Vivian wailed, her voice cracking with pure agony. "It is our home. Where are we supposed to go? You cannot do this to your own family. We have nothing left." I looked down at the woman who had abandoned me. I looked at the sister who had robbed her. I looked at the brother-in-law who had tried to extort me. And finally, I looked at the father who had just tried to disown me from a house he did not even own. I felt absolutely nothing but the pure, untethered freedom of a ghost finally breaking its chains. I flicked my wrist. The crisp white eviction notice fluttered down from the stage, drifting through the air before landing squarely against Richard's chest and falling to his feet. "You have until tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock to pack your bags and vacate my property," I said. my voice cold, steady, and completely devoid of mercy. Figure it out. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them, dropped the heavy red folder onto the wooden podium, and handed the microphone to the stunned event coordinator standing in the wings. I walked down the side stairs of the stage and moved purposefully through the crowd. The wealthy investors, the powerful politicians, and the financial journalists literally parted like the Red Sea to let me through. Nobody said a word. The only sounds echoing through the grand crystal-lit ballroom were the desperate, agonizing screams of my mother, the furious, broken sobbing of my sister, and the complete shattering collapse of the men who thought they could break me. I walked out the heavy oak doors, stepping into the cool, refreshing Atlanta night air, leaving the absolute ruins of my toxic family burning brightly behind me. The heavy oak doors of the country club closed behind me, cutting off the chaotic symphony of my family's destruction. The cool, refreshing air of the Atlanta night washed over my face, carrying away the suffocating stench of their lies. We cut back to the present moment. I am standing in the center of my glass-walled penthouse. The camera executes a slow, deliberate tracking shot circling me continuously as I gaze out over the glittering, sprawling city skyline. The amber liquid in my crystal bourbon glass catches the soft, warm light of the room. The absolute silence up here is not empty. It is the heavy, deeply satisfying silence of a total and unconditional victory. Let me tell you exactly what happens when you corner a rat on a sinking ship. It does not try to patch the hole. It does not try to save the other rats. It simply jumps. That exact night, while the country club staff was still sweeping up the shattered champagne glasses and the discarded fake environmental documents from the ballroom floor, Chad was already running for his life. He did not drive his leased Porsche back to the luxury apartment he shared with my sister. He knew my financial acquisitions team had already triggered the immediate recall clauses on every single loan attached to his name. He knew the vehicle would be actively tracked and repossessed by sunrise. He abandoned the car in the country club parking lot, left the keys in the ignition, and took an anonymous rideshare straight to the international airport. Chad spent the darkest hours of the morning sitting in a cheap fluorescent-lit motel room near the departure terminals, sweating through his custom-tailored velvet suit. By 3 o'clock in the morning, while Chloe was frantically calling his phone from the lobby of a police precinct, trying to figure out how to handle our mother's identity theft accusations, Chad was furiously typing on his laptop. He electronically filed for an emergency dissolution of marriage. He filed for divorce before the sun even came up. He threw his beloved wife, the woman he had sworn to protect and cherish, directly to the wolves. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to legally sever himself from her massive credit card fraud. He genuinely thought that if he abandoned her fast enough, the federal authorities might somehow overlook his own staggering mountain of wire fraud. He thought he could just hop on a plane, leave the country, and start another scam somewhere else. He was spectacularly wrong. The financial journalist standing in the front row at the launch party did not just write a little gossip column about a wealthy family having a public argument. They had been handed a certified, meticulously documented trail of corporate money laundering on a silver platter. By Sunday evening, the Wall Street Journal had published a blistering front-page exposé on his fake technology startup, detailing exactly how he had used non-existent software to siphon venture capital into offshore accounts. The brilliant technology founder was exposed as nothing more than a common thief wearing a velvet jacket. By Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, a team of federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation simultaneously raided his rented co-working space and his cheap motel room. They dragged the Silicon Valley visionary out into the hallway in handcuffs. He did not have his slick corporate buzzwords to save him. He did not have his arrogant smirk. He was sobbing, begging the federal agents for a phone call, completely bankrupt and utterly terrified. Chad is currently sitting in a federal holding facility in downtown Atlanta. My legal team ensures I receive daily updates on his miserable situation. He is facing multiple federal indictments for investor fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The prestigious white family he boasted about, the legacy Vivian was so desperate to align herself with, immediately released a ruthless public statement, completely disowning him to protect their own fragile social standing. They cut off his access to any familial legal counsel. The arrogant man who sat at the head of my dining room table and condescendingly lectured me about the future of decentralized capital is now desperately relying on an overworked public defender. He is trying to negotiate a plea deal just to avoid spending the next 20 years in a maximum security prison. Every single dollar he ever stole has been seized frozen and repossessed by Apex Commercial Trust to cover the massive debts he owed me. And then there is Chloe, my beautiful, perfect younger sister, the golden child who could do no wrong. She returned to her apartment that night, abandoning our mother at the country club, only to find the locks already changed by the property management company. Chad had not paid the rent in 4 months, quietly pocketing the money instead. She was left standing on the cold concrete sidewalk in her torn, heavily sequined designer dress, clutching a cloudy, debt-financed diamond ring that was essentially worthless. She had no husband, no home, no money, and a completely destroyed credit score. Her entire identity had been meticulously built on the illusion of superiority and the stolen funds of our mother. That illusion evaporated in a matter of hours. The glamorous billionaire lifestyle she thought she had secured by tearing me down had turned into a suffocating nightmare she could not wake up from. She tried to call her wealthy socialite friends for a place to stay, but the news of her identity theft had already spread like wildfire through their exclusive circles. Nobody answered her calls. She was completely ostracized, treated like a radioactive pariah by the very people she had stolen from our mother to impress. The golden child was finally forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world without my stolen college fund or Vivian's blind protection to save her. She sat on the curb outside her locked apartment building, sobbing into her hands as the sun came up over the city. For the first time in her entire 31 years of life, there was nobody left to clean up her mess. There was nobody left to blame for her own disastrous choices. She was completely and utterly alone, drowning in the catastrophic consequences of her own boundless greed. And as I stand here looking out over the city, I conquered, taking another slow sip of my bourbon. I do not feel a single drop of pity for her. 3 days passed. The eviction notice I dropped on the stage was not an empty threat. By 8 o'clock Monday morning, the property management company arrived at the brick colonial house, accompanied by local law enforcement. Vivian and Richard were forced to pack whatever they could carry and vacate the premises immediately. They had spent years pretending to be wealthy, but without my secret financial life support, they did not even have enough savings to secure a deposit on a cheap apartment. They had alienated their church friends with their endless arrogance, and their social circle had completely evaporated overnight following the public scandal. They had nowhere left to run. So on Wednesday afternoon, they arrived at their final, desperate destination: the towering wrought iron gates of my private high-security residential estate. I was sitting in my home office when the perimeter alert chimed softly from the integrated security console on my desk. I touched the screen, bringing up the high-definition feeds from the external cameras. There they were, my mother and my father standing on the hot asphalt outside the massive steel gates. They were surrounded by a pathetic pile of mismatched luxury luggage, hastily stuffed trash bags, and whatever meager belongings they had managed to salvage. The pristine, arrogant facade they had worn for decades was completely gone. Vivian was wearing wrinkled sweatpants, her hair unkempt, the heavy makeup smeared and running down her face. Richard looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 3 days, his shoulders slouched in total humiliating defeat. They walked up to the titanium call box. Vivian pressed the intercom button, her hands shaking visibly on the camera feed. "Yes, state your name and business," the calm, robotic voice of the estate private security chief answered. "Please," Vivian sobbed into the speaker, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered desperation. "I need to speak to Maya. I am her mother. This is her father. We have nowhere else to go. Please just open the gate and let us talk to her. We know she is in there. Tell her we are so sorry. Tell her we just need a place to stay for a few nights until we figure things out." I watched the monitor in absolute silence. The camera resolution was so sharp, I could see the sweat dripping down Richard's forehead as he stared hopelessly at the imposing metal barrier. He leaned toward the speaker, his voice a pathetic trembling whisper. "Maya, if you can hear this, please forgive us. We made terrible mistakes. We were blinded by pride. You are our daughter. You are our flesh and blood. God teaches us to forgive. Please do not leave us out here on the street like dogs." It was the exact same manipulative tactic they had used my entire life. They were trying to weaponize religion, biology, and guilt to bypass the boundaries they had violently disrespected. They thought that if they cried hard enough, if they looked pitiful enough, the natural instinct of a child to seek her parents' love would ultimately override my logic. They genuinely believed that beneath the cold corporate exterior, I was still the terrified 16-year-old girl, desperate for their approval. My security chief's voice crackled over my private earpiece. "Ms. Maya, we have two unauthorized individuals at the main gate requesting access. They are claiming to be immediate family. How would you like us to proceed?" I stared at the screen. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. I did not feel the bitter sting of residual anger. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world, the people who had stolen my future and abandoned me to freeze, and I felt absolutely profoundly nothing. The emotional cord had been severed completely. They were just two strangers standing on a sidewalk, dealing with the inevitable consequences of their own toxic choices. "Deny entry." I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any pity. "Inform them that if they do not remove themselves and their belongings from the perimeter within 3 minutes, you will dispatch a patrol unit to have them arrested for trespassing." "Understood," the security chief replied. I watched through the monitors as the speaker crackled to life at the gate. "Access denied," the guard announced firmly. "You have 3 minutes to vacate the private access road before law enforcement is contacted." Vivienne let out a wail of pure anguish, collapsing onto her knees right there on the pavement. She grabbed the thick steel bars of the gate, shaking them weakly while sobbing my name. Richard tried to pull her up, his face buried in his hands, as the reality of their permanent exile finally crushed the last ounce of his spirit. I did not turn away. I watched them drag their heavy, overstuffed bags down the long stretch of asphalt, walking away from my fortress until they completely disappeared from the camera frame. The screen returned to a static view of the empty gate. I reached out, tapped the glass surface of the monitor, and closed the application. The past was finally permanently erased. The phone vibrated against the polished quartz surface of my desk. The screen lit up, displaying an unknown local number. I almost ignored it. But a quiet, instinctual part of my mind knew exactly who was on the other end of the line, and I knew this chapter required a definitive, irreversible period at the end of the sentence. I picked up the phone, swiped the screen to answer, and pressed it to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited. The sound of ragged, uneven breathing filled the line, followed immediately by a wet, choking sob. It was Vivienne. She had clearly borrowed a phone from a stranger on the street, likely because her own device had been shut off when her stolen credit lines were frozen. Maya, Vivienne wept, her voice thick with a desperate, clinging panic. "Maya, please do not hang up on me. Please. You have made your point. You have punished us enough. Your father and I are sitting on a public bus bench with our suitcases. We have absolutely nothing left. You won the war." I remained completely silent, letting the raw reality of her panic echo in the quiet sanctuary of my office. When her begging was met with a wall of silence, Vivienne instantly pivoted to the only weapon she had left in her arsenal. She unleashed the ultimate, deeply ingrained cultural guilt trip. "Maya, I am your mother," she cried, her voice rising in pitch as she desperately attempted to summon a righteous authority she had completely surrendered years ago. "I carried you in my womb for 9 months. I endured the pain of childbirth to bring you into this world. I clothed you and fed you when you were a small child. You owe me a basic level of human respect. We are a Black family, Maya. Black families stick together through thick and thin. We do not throw each other out into the streets to be devoured by the world. Society is already hard enough on us, we have to protect our own blood. You cannot just turn your back on your own mother because you acquired a little bit of wealth. God is watching you right now, Maya. He sees exactly how you are treating the woman who gave you breath. She kept going, pouring out decades of conditioned manipulation. She weaponized the heavy, suffocating concept of the black tax, the unspoken toxic expectation that the one person who manages to escape the cycle of poverty and dysfunction is forever obligated to drag the rest of the family across the finish line. She expected me to play the role of the strong black woman, the mule who silently absorbs the pain and financial failures of her relatives, simply because she possesses the strength to carry the burden. She demanded blind, unconditional loyalty in the name of shared trauma and matching DNA. I listened to every single word. I did not interrupt her. I let her completely empty her emotional magazine, firing every single bullet of guilt she possessed, until she was left gasping for air on a public bench waiting for me to break. When the line finally fell quiet, save for the sound of city traffic passing by in her background, I took a slow, deep breath. I did not yell. I did not cry. I spoke with a voice made of absolute unbreakable ice. "You did give me life, Vivian," I said softly, the words cutting through the phone line with surgical precision. "You gave me life, and then you stole my future to protect a thief. You demand loyalty in the name of family, but you only remember we are blood when you need someone to fund your fake reality. You want to talk about what I owe you? You want to talk about debts?" I walked slowly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling corporate empire I built with my own two hands. "The 16-year-old girl who froze in the dark already paid you back for my life," I told her, my tone completely unwavering. "She paid you back when she sat in a foreclosed house with no electricity, reading a yellow sticky note that told her to figure it out. She paid your debt with every tear she cried alone, every double shift she worked for minimum wage, and every single time she had to parent herself because her mother was too busy pretending to be wealthy. That little girl is dead, Vivian, and she took your daughter with her." Vivian let out a sharp, choked gasp, desperately trying to formulate a response, but I did not give her the chance. "I am a self-made millionaire," I stated with absolute chilling clarity. "I am not a bank for your endless dysfunction. I am not a financial shield for your toxic mistakes. You told me to figure it out 19 years ago. Now it is your turn." I pulled the phone away from my ear. I pressed the red button, cutting off her hysterical wail mid-sentence. I opened the security settings, navigated to the contact menu, and permanently blocked the number. The screen went black. The connection was completely severed. The silence that filled my penthouse was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was the pure, breathable air of total liberation. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I had not felt in nearly 2 decades. I did not turn on the local news to see if Chad had been formally arraigned by the federal authorities. I did not look at my blocked messages folder to check if my parents were still begging on the streets. I simply made a cup of black coffee, sat at my kitchen island, and opened my laptop to review my morning briefs. Society loves to preach about the importance of generational wealth, especially within the Black community. We are constantly told to build massive empires, to endure unbearable burdens, and to sacrifice our own peace so our families never have to struggle again. But the brutal truth that nobody wants to talk about is that handing wealth to a deeply toxic family does not break generational curses. It just gives the curse a much larger budget. If I had written that $5 million check to Chad, I would not have been investing in my family. I would have been funding the very arrogance, laziness, and manipulation that almost destroyed my life. True generational wealth is not about enabling the abusers who share your bloodline. It is about actively funding the survivors. It is about finding the people who have the drive, the resilience, and the sheer willpower to succeed, but lack the capital to get started. I got dressed in a sharp white tailored suit, drove to the Apex Commercial Trust headquarters, and walked directly into my executive boardroom. Waiting for me around the massive quartz table was not a group of arrogant tech bros or greedy relatives demanding handouts. It was a group of 20 young, incredibly brilliant black men and women. They were former foster youth kids who had recently aged out of the system and teenagers who had been completely abandoned by their own parents. They were the kids who had been handed their own metaphorical yellow sticky notes and told to figure it out all by themselves. 3 years ago, I quietly launched the Apex Foundation for Urban Innovation. It is a comprehensive business incubator and financial grant program specifically designed for marginalized youth who have survived severe family abandonment. While my mother was maxing out fraudulent credit cards to buy designer dresses, and my sister was faking a luxurious lifestyle, I was quietly funding full-ride university scholarships and commercial seed capital grants. I sat down at the head of the boardroom table and looked at a young woman named Keisha. She was 19 years old, exactly the same age I was when I finally managed to secure my first real apartment. Keisha had just pitched a brilliant, highly scalable logistics software that completely blew Chad's fake decentralized ecosystem out of the water. I did not give her empty buzzwords or a condescending lecture. I reached across the table and handed her a red approval folder containing a $250,000 string-free startup grant. The look of pure, overwhelming shock and profound gratitude on her face was worth more than every single property in my portfolio. That is what real investment looks like. Over the next 2 hours, I signed off on over $2 million in business grants, real estate down payments, and educational trusts for those 20 young adults. I am giving them the exact safety net I was violently denied. I am ensuring that they do not have to spend the next 19 years operating in pure survival mode just to prove their worth to people who never loved them. I am teaching them how to read commercial leases, how to leverage corporate credit, and most importantly, how to build ironclad boundaries around their mental health and their bank accounts. My family demanded a legacy. They wanted to ride my coattails to the top and claim my success as their own. But the legacy I am building has absolutely nothing to do with the last name they gave me. I am breaking the cycle of the toxic black tax. I am taking the millions of dollars my family felt so inherently entitled to, and I am using it to aggressively fund the dreams of the exact type of children they threw away. That is how you truly change a community. You stop pouring your hard-earned water into a bucket full of holes, and you start watering the seeds that are actually fighting to grow in the concrete. Let us return to the present moment, standing in the center of this glass fortress. The camera slowly begins to pull back, detaching itself from the intimacy of my immediate space. It glides backward on a smooth, invisible track, gradually revealing the massive, breathtaking scale of my penthouse. The lens captures the sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows, the priceless modern art that adorns the polished walls, and the sprawling, glittering expanse of the Atlanta skyline stretching out into the infinite night. This room is not merely a display of financial wealth. It is a physical manifestation of quiet, unshakable power. It is a sanctuary built brick by brick on a solid foundation of absolute self-reliance. As the camera creates more distance between us, it frames me perfectly against the backdrop of the city I conquered. I am no longer the terrified 16-year-old girl shivering in the dark, reading a cruel note, and wondering how she is going to survive the bitter winter. I am the sole architect of my own destiny, standing completely unbothered in the center of an empire that I constructed from the ashes of their profound betrayal. The world deeply loves a traditional redemption story. Society is relentlessly obsessed with the idea of the prodigal family returning, asking for grace and being welcomed back with open arms and a tearful embrace. We are conditioned from birth to believe that blood is an unbreakable bond, a sacred covenant that somehow requires us to endure an unlimited amount of disrespect, financial extortion, and emotional abuse in the name of unconditional love. We are constantly told to turn the other cheek, to always be the bigger person, and to continuously shrink ourselves so that the people who repeatedly hurt us can feel comfortable in our presence. I look directly into the camera lens, completely breaking the invisible wall between my world and yours. I lock eyes with you, ensuring that every single word I say next resonates with absolute, undeniable clarity. They say forgiveness brings peace. But sometimes ironclad boundaries and total severance bring the ultimate peace. You do not owe your success to the people who actively prayed for your downfall. You do not owe a seat at your table to the people who secretly tried to poison your food. Family is supposed to be a safe harbor, not a relentless financial sinkhole and a daily psychological battlefield. Do not ever let anyone use matching DNA to extort your sanity. Do not let them use a shared history as leverage to fund their toxic present. You have the absolute right to walk away from anyone who views your existence as an open bank account and your boundaries as a personal insult. I slowly raise my heavy crystal glass of aged bourbon. The amber liquid beautifully catches the glowing city lights one final time. I offer a silent, solitary toast to the beautiful, untethered freedom of walking away. I bring the glass to my lips and take a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the sweet, burning taste of absolute victory.